Hello everyone, welcome to another Java for Testers tutorial. In this tutorial, we are going to discuss another very important topic, which is encapsulation. Now, encapsulation in Java is important in terms of whether you are a Java developer or you are trying to do a Selenium automation. So understanding this concept is really important from the automation perspective as well as from the interview perspective. Whenever you are going for an interview, Selenium interview, this question is very frequently asked. So encapsulation is basically, if you browse through the definitions over the internet, you will find that encapsulation is wrapping up of data under a single unit. When we say wrapping of the data, so for example, you have a particular class and your class will have certain data types, so integer, string, whatever data you define within that particular class, and then you will have the method that manipulate that data or work on that particular data. So when you bind the code that is within your class and the data together, that is basically what encapsulation means. And we'll understand this all in detail with an example, so don't worry about it. I just want to cover briefly about the theoretical concept of encapsulation. Now, how you will achieve encapsulation is a two-step process. So the first step is basically to define your data that is there in your class as the private data, because you don't want it to be accessible outside, and we'll understand why you don't want to be your data to be exposed. And then you want to achieve the abstraction, so basically have the methods available that are exposed outside that particular class, which can be utilized to set and get data. So these are called setter and getter methods. So this is a brief about the encapsulation, and the encapsulation term came from the medical term of capsule. So in the capsule, you don't know what exactly is the configuration of medicine that is inside. So from the outside world, you just know that a capsule has the outer layer, and within that you are not aware what exactly is the configuration of medicine. Now encapsulation is Java is same thing, or you can correlate it with the same concept. Within your class, when you encapsulate data and the methods that are working or the manipulating that particular data, that shouldn't be visible to the outside world. And this is another security. The reason for doing this is basically to secure the data that is there within your class and the method. You don't want to expose the actual manipulation logic to the external world. So you'll simply write the method and encapsulate the data that manipulates that particular data into your class, and then expose that method to the external world. Now how you will achieve it is we are going to understand this with the example. Now I'll take an example of, say for example, you are trying to develop a game. So let me create a class and I'll name the class as common, right? So why I'm naming the class as common? Because I want to store all the common methods and the data that those methods will be utilizing into this particular common method, which can be used by other classes. So I'll simply create a common class. Now in the common class, say you are working on a video game and you are developing a game, and that particular game requires certain objects to be created. So for example, I want to create object or boxes of different size in that particular game. Now if we talk about writing that box creation piece of code again and again, then I can write it in each of the classes that I'll write for box creation. But that's not a good practice, and the whole purpose of Java is that you or the OOPS concept is that you basically have the common method, and then by the different OOPS concept, you basically reuse the code components that you have defined. So in the common, what I'll do is I can define my data. So I'll simply say int length, so which is the length of the box, and similarly I'll define the width and height of the box. So let me change it to width and height, right? So these are the three data types that will be required to create any box, right? So if you want to create any box, you will have the dimensions, length, width, and height. You have to specify, and based on that, the box will be created. Now within this common method, you can also define set dimension for the box. So I can simply create a method, and I'll say public void and set, or I'll say set box dimension, right? Now when we say set box dimension, I want to specify the dimension of the box. So I can provide the three variables or three parameters for this particular set box dimension method. I'll say length, and then breadth and height, right? And based on what length, breadth, and height a person has passed, let me print just a sysout statement. So here I'll say box created, or I'll say dimensions box created with dimensions, and let me append length. So I'll print length and then breadth, and I'll print the height. So what this, if somebody or some other class is calling this particular method and providing length, width, and height, then it will print this particular statement. Now here I haven't specified any access modifier. So usually in normal scenarios, you will specify the access modifier as public, so that these variables or these methods, so here these variables and method are accessible to anyone in other classes, right? So I have specified, or I have mentioned these variables length, width, and height, and the set box dimension method as public. Now if there is, or you say for example you are developing a video game wherein you want to use this set box dimension method, right? So you don't have to write the logic to create that box or set that box dimension. So that logic here, I'm just printing one statement, but ideally you will be having a lot of code to basically create the set or create the box with that particular dimension, and it will show you on the screen when you are developing your game. Now when somebody is calling this method, so say for example another class is calling this method, so I can say here I'll say create box, and I'll have the main method here. And within this main method, if I want to access the method and variables or the data types that are defined in this particular class, what I'll do is I'll simply create an object of this class and can use it, right? So I can simply say common cm is equal to new common, right? So that's the name of my class. And then if I say cm dot, you will see that I'm able to access these variables that I have defined, height, length, and width, as well as set box dimension method, right? Now I can simply call this height variable, and I can set the height of the variable height, right? And similarly I can set the other, so I'll say length, and I'll say length is 20, and then cm dot width, and in the width I'll specify the width as 30. And now I can call set box dimension, and I can pass these height, length, and width. So let me store it into the int type. So I'll say length, and then I'll say int b as breadth, and int height. Okay, so this is breadth, and this is length, and this is height, right? Okay, so now when I'll call this particular method and run this, I'll get the statement printed with box created with dimension 20, 30, and 10, right? Now in this case, what is the flaw in this particular design? So for example, I can specify 0 as a height, -10 as length, and 0 as width again. Okay, and let's say if we run this, what is the result? You will see box created with dimension -10, 0, 0. So this is not what we want. In order to create any box, it has to have the valid dimensions, right? So that is one of the scenario wherein you don't want any external class to access your data that is inside this particular common class directly. Now, because we have this access modifier public for this particular data, these are accessible outside, right? So that's where encapsulation comes in picture. Now, the first step in encapsulation is to safeguard your data that you don't want to share outside of this particular class. To safeguard this data, instead of public, we'll use the access modifier private. Okay, so all these three variables that we have defined, I'll use the access modifier as private so that these variables are not accessible outside this particular common class. And as soon as I have changed these to private, you can see that here now I can't access these variables and I can't manipulate from the create box class. Okay, so these are no longer valid now. So what this means is, now because any external class cannot access the variables that are defined in this particular class, so in order to assign the values to these variables and use this set box dimension method to create or set the box dimensions, it has to get, or it has to come from a particular method, and that's where getter and setter method come in picture. Now to define the getter and setter, when we say getter method, it gets the value of the variable that is defined in that particular class. So for example, you want to get the value of length, width and height, you define the getter for length, width and height. If you want to set the values or set the data for length, width and height, you define the setter method. Now in order to define the getter and setter methods, we simply need to define a public method to get and set data. So we can say public, and here let me start with the return type as void, and then I'll change it accordingly. And I want to set the length, so I'll say set length, and this method will accept a argument. So I'll define a parameter int L here, and whatever value has been passed by the person. So for example, whosoever is calling this method, he can pass 10, 20, whatever. Based on that, I want to assign the value that is passed to this particular length variable, which is inside this class, which is private, right? And then I'll simply return this length. Okay, that's it. So this is the setter method. Now if you see, if I hover over, I have to change this return type to integer because I'm returning an integer, so I can't have it as void. Okay, so this is the set length method. Similarly, let me quickly create the set length or set width and set height method. Alright, so here I'll pass width, and width will be associated with, or width will be assigned to the width private variable, and here I'll return width. And similarly for the height, I'll have the height variable which will be returned. So these are the setter methods that we have defined to set the length, width and height that will be utilized in this particular set box dimension. Now similarly the getter method, so if I want to get the height, length and width, right, here it's set height. So what I'll do is I'll simply define the getter method, and I'll say get height, and I don't need this variable or parameter, and just return the height. Okay, so these are the getter methods. So let me create the getter method for width and height as well. So width, so we have it for the height, so we'll have width and length. All right, so let me copy width. So this will return the width and this will return the length. So now we have these methods, getter and setter methods, that are defined in this particular class to get and set the length, width and height. Okay, now in the create box, what we can simply do is we can say int L, and we can simply call the getter and setter method to set the width and height. So we can say set width, and I can specify the width as 10, and similarly, oh sorry, this is okay, let me change it to width or B in this case, and then I'll use the length, so I can say cm dot set length, and I'll specify the length as 20, and then height, I'll use the method cm dot set height. All right, and height I'll specify as, say for example, I'll specify 15 to keep all of them unique. Now I'm not calling these variables directly or data directly, and I'm not manipulating this data directly. Now I'm manipulating the data using the setter and getter or set methods that I have defined. And now these, whatever value that I am setting is being passed on to this set box dimension as length, width and height. And now if I run this, you will see the box created with the dimension that we have provided here. Okay, and now if I want to get the dimension, so if I just want to print what are the dimensions that I have provided for length, width and height, so I can simply use the method cm dot get length, and it will print the length. So in this case, length is specified as 20, so it should print 20 in the next line, right? So you can see 20 has been printed and box created with that dimension. Okay, so now what we are trying to learn here is basically we have made our data private. So this data cannot be manipulated directly by any other class. If anyone wants to manipulate this particular length, width and height, they have to call this set length, width and height method to basically manipulate any of the data that I have defined here. All right, the other advantage, the core advantage, is basically now here you have seen that we were able to provide the invalid values to height, length and width. We can still do that right here. I haven't provided or haven't written any logic to stop this, right? So still it will work, and it still you will see that box created with dimension and whatever dimension you have set. Now with the encapsulation, when you have the setter and getter method, you can have the logic within your setter method to stop any invalid data. Now in this case, say for example, I don't want somebody to set the length which is invalid or basically equal to 0 or less than 0. So I can simply write a logic within this particular block set length method, and I can say if, with a simple if statement, I'll explain this. If L is greater than or equal to 1, only then I want to assign the value that is being provided by the set length method by the end user to length, and otherwise I want to print an error, invalid length. Okay, So in this case, and then at the last return length, right? So this statement or the return statement has to be the last statement in your method. So it will return the length, whatever valid length has been specified. Now if I go ahead and here if I specify length as 0, now you will see the message will get printed as invalid length. So let me run it and you will see invalid length got printed. It still worked, or it still printed box created with dimension 0, because in the common or in this particular method I haven't created any logic to basically restrict my box creation when these values are not valid. So similar to what I have done here, I can specify this information, or I can write the same code in this set box dimension as well. So what I'll do is here is I can simply say if L is greater than or equal to 1, right? And so I'll basically verify that all these values or length, width and height are greater than or equal to 1. If they are less than 1, then I don't want to basically create the box. Okay, so this is just hypothetical and I'm explaining you to basically understand the concept of encapsulation. So I can provide breadth is greater than or equal to 1, and then similarly for the height, so I can say height is greater than or equal to 1. Then in that case only you print this statement or you create the box, if that is the condition. Otherwise you just throw an error, invalid dimensions. Okay, now I have this logic here. So now when somebody is calling these methods, so now here set box dimension will be called, and because there is length that is being set up as invalid, which is less than 1, I should get the error that invalid length and invalid dimensions, and it shouldn't create the box. But if I provide the valid dimensions, say for example I provide the dimension as 15 as for the length, then it will give me the result box created with the dimensions that I have provided or the valid dimension. So this is the core concept of encapsulation and why you should be using encapsulation. So now you can see that none of my data that is within this class, length, width and height, can be directly manipulated from the other class, which is the create box class. I have to use the setter method to set the length, width and height, and also I can write the logic within these method to basically restrict the box creation if there is any invalid entry. So all this code that we have written here in the setter and getter method, this is not visible to someone who is using these methods, right? So this is the whole concept of encapsulation. And if we talk about some of the advantages, so we have looked at the advantage of hiding the data. So we have hidden this length, width and height from the external classes by using this private keyword, and it also provides us the reusability. So we have defined this method set box dimension, and that can be reusable, or any class that want to define the box dimension can use this particular method. So this is all about the encapsulation concept in Java. Please go through the details of the encapsulation, understand it in very much detail. This will be really important from Selenium automation perspective, or even your basic Java learning perspective and interviews. So that's all for this tutorial. Hope you like it. Thank you very much for watching.